to follow up with this and to push it a little further, do our students get an opportunity to ask the questions that really bother them? Is this kind of questioning threatening to teachers, threatening to administrators? How can this be handled most sensitively and effectively? How do we nurture the student who doesn't buy into the ideology? Okay.
I mentioned before that I just came from a month in camp. And I think that once upon a time, camp was viewed as something to keep the kids busy with during the summer. But the concept of camp has changed, and we now see a whole field of informal education that runs parallel to the formal schooling that we give our children. Informal schooling, I think in day schools, it could be that I can't say that under no circumstances, but there are many, many cases in which there just aren't those opportunities. If you have a Chumash class, if you have a Gemara class, depending on the particular relationship between student and teacher, these questions might come up and be dealt with, or they might in fact be put aside. All too often the sense I have from talking to kids in informal settings, like camp, is that in the formal settings they don't feel that those kind of questions are welcome. One of the great things about informal settings is that there are really opportunities for these questions to be raised and dealt with. I think that one of the challenges is that very often they are raised and dealt with not with people who have years and years of experience and learning, but oftentimes with role models who are really positive and wonderful role models, but are essentially kids that are just a few years older than the ones who are asking the questions. And I think that schools would do well to set up opportunities to discuss these kinds of things. As far as I think the much more challenging question was the last one you raised with regard to how to deal with kids who are uncomfortable or reject some of the basic value system. I don't know that this is a setting where we can where I can offer an answer to that, but certainly there should be opportunities, either formally or informally, for kids to ask these kind of questions. And I just have the sense that in the existing curricula in many, many schools, the courses are much more focused on texts that will not lead to these kind of questions being raised, and these, I think, are things that schools have to think about.
Okay, my turn to tell a story. One of my students in Ramaz came in one day very excitedly and said, we had a debate in English class about whether God existed. We took a vote and God lost. I asked for equal time. Would you like to see my presentation about that? I said, yes, I would. And he showed me what he said. And I was thinking about that. Why did that come up in English class? It came up in English class because it's safe. For that to come up in a Judaic studies class, you might antagonize the teacher who will think all kinds of things about you, and that would be unfortunate. And I said, it's really terrible that the only place that it's safe to bring up these kinds of discussions would be in contexts where the faculty member would not support it or would even use it against the students. And so at that point, we designed a course at Ramaz, which essentially raised the issues of conflicts that probably would arise as students would go through their secular education going forward. I think that that's really the kind of thing that a school needs to do. Obviously, you need the kind of faculty person who is interested in this and sympathetic to it. And in that way, having a course, then even if a student is afraid to ask certain questions, well, they just can sit there and listen. They don't have to ask. They don't have to stick their necks out, because if you're going to cover that stuff and you're going to give them the readings that are going to deal with that, well, they're dealing with it, however actively or not actively they wish to participate. Number two, I think certainly in a high school, there should be an attempt to combine and to get students to try to do research on some of these things. The kinds of readings that they are given, the kinds of papers that they have to write, should be those kinds which, again, are not considered irrelevant, but really strike to the heart of some of these issues to make them grapple with them and to give them the support that will help them do that. Then all of a sudden, school will be extremely meaningful and will have value, as opposed to something that they have to go through and something that where they have to just meet standards but not feel that it's terribly personal or terribly relevant.
First of all, that's an awesome question. I think that's a really amazing question. I think that there are a couple of issues that need to be raised in this context. One is that most schools, especially Orthodox day schools, really don't like dealing with failure. And it's hard when you people are paying you a fortune and you really dedicate your life. It's really hard to face failure. And one has to, I think, acknowledge up front that a significant percentage of the kids who raise really important questions are not going to have them answered satisfactorily. Certainly not going to have them answered satisfactorily for a long time. And that means that if you ask the question, you're going to have to deal with a kid sitting in your classroom whom you know perfectly well is not actually, is very likely not buying in. That's frustrating psychologically for the teacher, and it is also difficult to maintain the atmosphere of a class where often, you walk into a classroom and it's a very different atmosphere if you say, we are now going to collectively try to understand Dvar Hashem, as opposed to we are now going to collectively try to figure out if we think this is Dvar Hashem. Right? Those are two very different classroom atmospheres, and if half of you are there to understand Dvar Hashem and half of you are there to try and figure out whether this is Dvar Hashem, you're not really having a joint class. So I think those are both real issues. I can say that my time in Maimonides, I know that one of the ongoing things was which became cause celebs, where if there were kids who stopped being frum in college, everyone would blame the secular environment of college. But if it happened in my classroom, or at least outside of classroom, I was open to that, so I would often know perfectly well before the kids left high school that they had no intention of being frum, but the school was unwilling to acknowledge that. And again, but I think that there's a good reason often for the school not to acknowledge that, because it's not actually the case that in a school which works reasonably on the presumption that most of its students are just there to learn what Dvar Hashem is, that you can regularly deal in the classroom with a student who is bothered by that. You might let a student ask that question once, but after that you can't spend your time working on first premises when the rest of the class isn't there. So it really has to be thought about what the purpose of each class is and how students function together. The other thing is that there are a whole set of questions. The high-level intellectual, there's a set of subjective questions that some teachers are really good at and some teachers are not. Some teachers are good at, I put on tefillin yesterday and it meant nothing to me, and all of a sudden I realized that tefillin never meant anything to me, so why do I ever do it, right? That's one kind of question, and some faculty members are good at that and some faculty members are not. And then there's an entirely different set of questions, which is really common in Boston, which are things like, my parent is a graduate professor of Bible, and they tell me, right, and they tell me X about Tanakh, and you're telling me you're telling me why in the classroom, or philosophic questions about the nature of God, where it's probably unrealistic to expect most high school faculty to have the capacity to deal substantively with those questions, as opposed to try and model the capacity to deal with them. That also has to be, I think that having a model in which every teacher is responsive to every question might work in for an all-star team, but it doesn't work in and even there you would have to have people play different positions. Right, and we should think about that very much in constructing the school.